Greetings. Welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Ryan Craven, and our guest today is Jon Quinn. Jon is a lecturer at Indiana University with the Kelley School of Business in the marketing department. Jon also serves as the director for the Center of Brand Leadership and the Consumer Marketing Academy. He has 25 years of industry experience, including retail, restaurant, financial services, retail banking, CPG, and telecommunications sectors. Brands Jon has worked with include Sprint, Yum Brands, Applebee's, Mellon, Huntington Bank, and Bob Evans. All right, Jon. Well, thanks for joining us today. And I think
thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think our topic to start off with is, kind of talking about, give us a little bit about your background and expertise, and kind of get into, telling us a little bit more about, the tech-enabled retail behavior and obviously the impact that COVID-19 is having.
Sure. Well, so I joined Kelley about a year ago after a little over 25 years in industry. A little over half of that time was in the retail restaurant industry, but I've also been telecommunications, retail banking, financial services. Early in my career, I was an adjunct at the University of Pittsburgh, but then got married and had kids, and I started doing adjunct work again a couple years ago, several years ago now. I guess it'll be 4 years ago, at Ohio State, the Fisher's College of Business, with the intent of building my resume and making the switch over to full academia. And I was able to do that last year. I had a couple different offers. And the one I was obviously most excited about was joining the Kelley School of Business, which when I first set out on this mission to transition to academia, I would have probably put that in one of my dream jobs, but thought, chances might not have been that great, but it all worked out. So it's been fantastic. And I'm in a role where I get to leverage my experience in industry, not only in the classroom. I teach marketing research, digital marketing, also marketing strategy to undergraduates and MBA students. But also in about a week, I take over the Consumer Marketing Academy and the Center for Brand Leadership, where I leverage our relationships with our corporate partners and kind of serve as that liaison between our MBAs for their summer internships and for their careers upon graduation, kind of preparing them on that softer side of things. Exactly what it's like to be an associate brand manager and what sort of different types of cultures exist within marketing organizations. And so I get to leverage both of my passions, my industry experience and my love for teaching.
Perfect. Yeah, it sounds like a perfect mix, and we're glad to have you as part of the team. So just kind of based on the current trends and kind of what you're seeing and.
Yeah. So, when the COVID-19 kind of first broke, really kind of for us around spring break is when it really became a reality, even though we were kind of falling in the news before that. There was a wave of panic buying, but, soon after that kind of somewhat dissipated, a lot of the marketing professionals saying, okay, what's going to be the long-term implications of this? How's this going to shift? And initially there was a talk about a V-shaped recovery. I kind of knew in the very beginning that's going to be very naive. One of the terms I heard most recently is a Nike swoosh. And being a brand guy, it's like, okay, hey, I can wrap my mind around that. I know what that means, like a sharp decline and it's long, slow back uphill. And I do think that's what we're going to be headed towards. And I think a lot of it's going to be fueled by some of the impacts of consumer behavior, because when you look at percentage of consumer spending in the United States of GDP, it's 68 to 70%, which is higher than pretty much any developed country. I think when you look at Europe, the highest is the UK is 65%. Then the next highest is Italy at 60%, and everybody else is down in the 50s. So any shift in consumer behavior impacts the United States a little more dramatically. And some of the impacts I see and that I've been reading about seems like there's going to be a big emphasis on value. When we had a recession in the early 90s, very early in my career, I remember there was this term called downward experimentation, where budgets were starting to tighten. And, if you remember back in the early 90s, late 80s, the generics were a big thing. So whether it's private labels were just starting to really kind of take off in the early 90s. So people were downward experimenting with private label and generics and actually being somewhat satisfied. And the trade-off in quality versus what they're receiving in value was mostly acceptable. And that kind of had a little bit of a long-term effect and really kind of laid the groundwork for private labels to really grow throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. And then, in 2001, it was interesting that, you remember after 9/11, where we had a little bit of recession, and our President George Bush said, "Go to the mall," which seems like so antiquated now, right? It's like what, just to go power walk? But and then, in 2008, 2009, we had a similar type of thing where the value became a very important. And we're starting to see some of our, even some of our partners in the CMA, some of our partners are already starting to adapt to this. Kellogg's has come out with different communications on their packaging, clearly communicating how many servings are in there, so it better communicates the value proposition. Mondelez is coming up with new package sizes to be able to have a lower entry point. So if people are tightening their budgets, can still. Mondelez has a lot of snack and cookie type brands that used to be part of like Kraft or Nabisco, and they're coming out with smaller pack sizes. So I think we're going to see, and with this long recovery, I think this value impact is going to be a long-term thing. A couple other trends we're seeing is we think is like local sourcing, having a little more control over the supply chain and where our food's coming from, and having a little more knowledge about that, and a little more cognizant of it's, is it coming from our region or is it coming from overseas? And there's kind of an underlying consumer behavior behind that. It's like they want to feel a little more comfort and a little more control over what they're consuming, and feel like a little more at ease with it. And the other thing is e-commerce, obviously, and that's one of the things that has been covered most extensively, probably, is the degree of which we're going to see that shift. And that's definitely something that was slowly happening anyways. And now we're just kind of have, instead of this slow build, or when we look back this over the years, we're going to see this stair-step increase in 2020 because of this. So what we're going to, typically e-commerce as a percentage of retail is around 14 to 16%. We're ticking at around 20% right now, over 20. We're probably going to see, as things open up, we'll see that scale back a little bit, but I don't think we're going to go back to 14 or 16%. I think we're only going to go down a couple of ticks down to like 18%. And before you know it again, we'll be back up over 20 in the long term. What concerns me about the increase of e-commerce, and even things like, when restaurants start opening up, we're going to start using more disposable type goods and more packaging. And my fear is sustainability is going to take a hit on this, because, these more complex problems that people obviously can't really relate to on a day-to-day basis will take a back seat when their household incomes decreased. I saw a stat that 46% of Americans have seen their household income decrease, and I think it was another 26% are expecting to see it. If they haven't already, they're expecting to see it decrease this year. So that value piece of it's going to be a long-term impact. Yeah, but going back to the sustainability piece of it, though, I think of more complex concepts like sustainability and global climate change, even though it might be somewhat related to these type of virus outbreaks, it's going to be harder people to focus on when they're thinking about value and they're thinking about safety. So, when you think about that hierarchy, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we just slipped down a couple notches, right? So that betterment of society type thing is like, okay, I can't think about that right now. And, when we think about the international implication of that, that's where it's like sociological and cultural aspects come into play. The American culture is a little more individually focused, a little more consumer focused. So how it impacts us here in the States is going to be maybe a little more dramatic because of that. Because one thing we have, and we can see some of these demonstrations, and to my knowledge, and I haven't seen these same demonstrations in Spain or Italy, people getting angry about not being able to go out. And it's like that kind of American don't tread on me type of thing. Like we hold our individual rights so highly and so important to us that a few weeks after this, we start to a certain proportion of our population starts getting antsy and saying like, you know what, I'm tired of my rights being restricted. So we're less society focused than maybe some other like European or Asian countries are. And that's one reason like Shanghai's done such a good job controlling it.
Sure. And kind of following up on that to a certain extent, do you see kind of that need for consumer behavior and just, is that kind of what's driving, the reopening schedule really more so than kind of the testing?
Yeah, I think it has to do with like, since our economy is so heavily dependent on consumer spending, and it's been so dramatically cut back in the past 2 months, that is putting more pressure on us to be able to open things up, probably more than other countries, because we're feeling the sting a little more.
Well, and you had mentioned that before, that Italy has a similar level of consumer spending as kind of their percentage of GDP.
Yeah, 10% less than us. So they're at 60, we're at 70. So they're one of the closer comparisons, with the UK somewhere in between. But Germany below that.
And I haven't been following that piece of it nearly as closely, but it seems like, from a consumer standpoint, that the U.S. is definitely itching to get back and going much more quickly than, say, Italy, and we're a few weeks, 3-4 weeks behind, kind of their original schedule as far as the symptoms and kind of the outbreak.
Yeah, really, it's a kind of a two-pronged thing. It's like our economy is a little more dependent upon it, and we have like a cultural focus on individual rights. Those things together, the confluence of those things together, kind of put more pressure on us to open things up. And which, if we have a second wave, then some of these trends we just talked about will be like jet fueled.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned kind of the hopefully the shift, or the kind, you're starting to see that shift of more of a region, local economy sourcing, and you've kind of started to see a little bit of that trend before, but I think it takes something like this to really reemphasize and showcase kind of the vulnerability of those those supply chains and just how people get their goods.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, there's definitely kind of a steep knowledge curve right now that we're on. The people, I think society in general is becoming more aware, like, wow, there's a lot more behind what bringing this stuff to my local grocery store than I ever realized, and how interdependent we are with different regions and different countries, and how fragile it can possibly be. So two of those three trends I mentioned were already happening, right? The local sourcing and the e-commerce. And this is just kind of put like a little extra fuel behind those two. The value one's really kind of a new one that's popped up that will be with us for a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. As money gets tight, people want to make sure they're getting the exact thing they want and getting, like I said, good value out of what they're spending. And it is tricky, like you said, with the sustainability piece kind of underlying all of that as e-commerce drives. I mean, it's more delivery trucks out and more packaging and all those details, right?
Right. And even things like more servers and more heat being produced by those servers. It's just like it's something about the Earth's temperature. Like it's like 3% of it's being generated by servers of the global climate warming up. It's like and that's not insignificant.
Yeah, absolutely. kind of getting back to that trends on states, regions, kind of that local side of things. My family's originally from Illinois, and they're from a 40,000 size town, and one of the things they really struggle with is so much of those decisions being based off of how to reopen Illinois, and those guidelines are all really based off of Chicago's population. And yeah, that population density really needs to stay. Those impacts are major. And so, the difference of, kind of getting back to the local economy, the local regions, kind of being able to say, hey, this is our case, this is our economy, how can we open safely, versus it kind of being strictly dictated from, kind of
national
that
level.
state. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The concern to me about that is, and I heard this metaphor. It's like we're a swim, but our country is a big swim pool. And if somebody in the deep end is allowed to do one thing and somebody in the shallow end or the diving area is doing another, it's all eventually going to mix together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like we're treating it like in a regional basis, but it's gonna have a national impact eventually.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thanks for that input. It's an interesting time, and we'll just kind of have to continue to see what those trends do. Is there any kind of other information that you would be willing to share with us today?
It's just interesting to see how how the societal impact of this is going to continue to impact our economy and our consumer behavior. And it'll be also, and the other thing is, you got this later on this, you have a presidential election coming up in a few months. And depending on how that election results and all the other, if there's some sort of, blue wave, is it going to change how we're dealing with this? And if that changes how we deal with it, then how is consumer behavior going to kind of fall in line? So next few months is going to be very interesting.
Well, and like you mentioned with the election, and every election brings different perspectives and policy changes and kind of thoughts of how they want to do things, and all of that has a huge impact on consumer behavior and the local economy, and who does what and how they spend their money.
Yeah, and on the next couple of months of how well things are managed might impact that election.
Well, it sounds like you all have some interesting times ahead to study and kind of track, and best of luck with all that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm teaching a marketing strategy class this summer, and every session I bring in something that's covered in current events, and right now the current events are dominated by how brands are dealing with COVID-19. And it's really interesting. We have more eyeballs watching TV and consuming social media than we've had in quite a while. But advertising dollars are kind of shrinking for the most part, because a lot of companies are pulling back on their budgets. The one exception I saw to that, though, is in-game advertising. So video games. The advertising within video games is significantly up.
Yeah, I can only imagine why.
Yeah.
Well, John, thanks for taking the time today to speak with us, and take care.
All right, thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this edition of CIBER Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please email them to cyber@indiana.edu.